Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, virginiainstitute.org. Our first guest, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy for the American Legislative Exchange Council, Jonathan Williams, back on the program. Jonathan, I hope your spring has been going well for you.
Well, it has. It has. Good to be back with you, and greetings from the land of make-believe up here in Washington, D.C.
I don't know how to say this, Jonathan, nicely, but if we were a college football program, we'd be looking for a new head coach.
Unfortunately, you are absolutely right, and probably we'd be looking for a head coach a few years ago here in Virginia. And as you know, Joe, as a taxpayer here in the Commonwealth, this concerns me greatly. As somebody who just got my new assessment in the mail on my property taxes, this concerns me greatly. And let's hope that there's some new voices ready to turn things around here in Virginia very soon.
Well, I have the cell phone numbers of all the statewide candidates from the conservative side of the platform. I haven't heard Terry McAuliffe speak about this since he began this precipitous decline. We are down, and remind people before we talk about where Virginia ranks now, rich states, poor states, judges a myriad of different categories for states regarding, not just how much money they got.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the 14th year that we've put this report together with Reagan-era economist Art Laffer and Stephen Moore from the Wall Street Journal and FreedomWorks and other great organizations. And those two came to me with this in my first week at ALEC and said, let's come up with a project that we can rank the states and compare their policies against each other in the things that really matter for competitiveness. And so we look at things like taxes and regulation and labor policy. We choose 15. I mean, I suppose, Joe, we could choose 1,000 ways to differentiate states on policy, but we chose these 15 for a couple of reasons. And that, first of all, they're the things that matter the most in Art Laffer's research and what we think really does make a difference between states. But then secondly, and probably just as importantly, is there's so many different indices out there that attempt to rank states. A lot of them make the fatal flaw that they're ranking things that state legislators in Richmond and other state capitals have little or no control over, such as deep water ports or tourism or the weather, for instance, and some of it's almost laughable. And so we focus on variables in rich states, poor states that state legislators can control, they can change. In many cases, they can make a big difference even in a short amount of time.
So that said, Virginia at one time was a top 5 state, wasn't it? Not all that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago. I remember it well. I was standing in the state capitol in Richmond with my friend Bill Howell, and he was Speaker of the House at the time, and some of his legislative delegation, and we announced it there, and we launched a new edition about 10 years ago, and Virginia was number 3 with the third best economic outlook in America. And among all of the states now, Virginia is one of the biggest losers over the last decade, falling all the way to number 17 this year for economic outlook. So some pretty discouraging signs here in our home state.
More importantly, as an economic driver, how do we compare to West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, even Maryland? I think last year we were even falling behind Maryland.
And that's never a good place to be.
Yeah.
And so you look at, for instance, West Virginia and Maryland, slightly worse than Virginia still, although I will say, based on the conversations that happened over in Charleston this year, we had a real shot at eliminating the income tax altogether in West Virginia. In fact, the state Senate there passed it. It's got held up in the state house, but I think they'll be back for more because they've seen the population loss, and they're going to actually lose one of their 3 U.S. House districts, as you probably saw based on the new census numbers. Right. And conservatives now that run West Virginia in the legislature have said we need to get people moving back to West Virginia, and this is the right way to do it. But you mentioned Tennessee, which is a no-income tax state, and anybody that lives down in parts of Virginia that are close by the Tennessee line know exactly what that competitiveness brings to being a no personal income tax, both for individuals and small businesses. Let's not forget the pay on the individual side of the code. And then North Carolina, one of the most competitive states in America, ranking number 5 this year in rich states, poor states. Almost the exact reverse of what's happened in Virginia has happened in North Carolina, because they have actually taken their tax code, made it much more competitive and cut rates over time, and they have gone from the mid-20s early on in rich states, poor states, now all the way down to number 5. And so just an incredible turnaround for North Carolina.
You know, it was amazing. I was watching Reagan's Time for Choosing speech from 1964, right before the Republican primaries here in Virginia, and he was talking about how much inflation there had been and how little the 1964 dollar purchased versus its predecessors. I'm thinking, holy cow, this speech could be given today, $1.9, $2.8 trillion. Eventually, you start talking about real money, right?
Well, right, and that was the joke, a billion here, a billion there. Sooner you're talking about real money. Now it's really a trillion here and a trillion there, unfortunately, with all of these so-called stimulus plans in air quotes and so-called infrastructure plans in air quotes, and just the trillions of dollars that are being added to the national credit card in recent months. I mean, you have to ask yourself the question, Joe, is where does it end? I mean, it seems like a new kind of 5-year plan for every single policy area that this radical Biden administration and radical progressives in Congress are putting out there. And I think, Americans in some degree are just so inundated by the headlines, calling this COVID relief, calling it infrastructure. And it's really important to dig down into what exactly does this money go for, and what's the kind of return on investment American taxpayers can expect?
Mm-hmm.
Is it worth the huge credit card debt that we're racking up as a nation? And then, of course, the huge threat that you just alluded to there of inflation that, you and I have talked about many times in recent months. And sure enough, it's hitting the headline news, and this is a big problem going forward.
Is there a substantive problem underneath the surface of it as well? Because they talk about 6% of the spending plans go to actually what most people would agree are real infrastructure projects, but the vice president or the president has found a way around that by just inventing things that are infrastructure, daycare providers, and Lord only knows what else is infrastructure anymore. But I think the precedent on that is not just this spending bill, Jonathan, but ones to follow once we've established that pre-K education is infrastructure, and the crossing guard is infrastructure, and who knows what else.
Well, that's exactly right. And, we look at this has gone on for quite some time at the state level as we've followed state transportation, quote unquote, spending. And many of the times we're asked in Virginia, certainly, to pay higher gas taxes than we once did. And it's somewhat expectation that we get better roads and bridges or better construction and maintenance of those things. And then, you find out months or years later that actually a lot of these dollars went for bike paths, and I have nothing against bikes. I have one. I love bikes. Mm-hmm. But, beautification and planting flowers in the middle of the road, those are all great things if you have the luxury to pay for them. But I think of the average taxpayer across the country that is just trying to weather this incredibly difficult year, being asked to pay for higher taxes, to pay for some of these very dubious projects that are being called infrastructure, is a bridge too far.
And we won't be able to afford that even more so. But when you talk about the inflation that's going to have to come, we're already seeing some of the consumer goods, ironically, being outed by the WIC program because they have to buy the government cheese, as it were, that some of these staple goods are already up 6 or 7% in cost.
Right, exactly. And this is something that the top line numbers are starting to see it. We saw it with some of the recent news reports, but commodities, even before this just tragedy around the pipeline hack and the lackluster cybersecurity standards evidently we have around critical infrastructure in this country that are unfortunately being exposed this week with the pipeline situation and gas prices and shortages. Look at what gas prices did even previous to that over the last several months. And that is clearly an inflationary move in a lot of cases. If you've bought lumber anytime recently, if you've had to go to the hardware store and buy anything that's aluminum or copper, you've noticed that the prices of commodities, which exactly is what you'd expect to happen in an inflationary environment, even before some of the top line numbers tick up. And so, unfortunately, too many dollars chasing too few goods, the classic definition of inflation, Joe. And when we see these trillions of dollars being spent on the national credit card and by state and local governments, we shouldn't really be surprised why.
Jonathan Williams, American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC.org. Well, and I've read, my fair share of history, and economics is what kills democracies. It's why, at the onset anyway, we tried not to be a democracy purely, because history had shown us that democracies fall prey to our own self-interests.
Well, and that's right. It's only as good as, we have some restraint on the public treasury, right? Once people get the idea that they can spend as much as they like with other people's money, that's when we have real problems. And so, this is why it's so dangerous, some of these plans right now at the federal level, not just the spending side, but Joe, how the president is talking about how to fund these programs, which is let's tax the wealthy, tax the 1%, tax the rich, tax those evil corporations. And at the end of the day, this is a really easy way to get to that end, which is let's at least talk about it in a way that a very few percentage of Americans will pay for what we're going to give out in benefits to everyone. Now, the dirty little secret there, as you know very well, is businesses don't pay taxes, people pay taxes. And so anytime the corporate rate, let's say, goes up in America, and under this current proposal talked about in D.C. would be higher than communist China, for instance, that is going to be borne by all of us. And that is the important point to remember. Taxes will be borne by all Americans.
Well, and isn't it also fair that these S-corps, these individual proprietorships, these small businesses, whether they be a landscaping company or a coffee roastery or some of these places, the owner of the company has got a, quote, $1 million income, and they're going to be the ones hit with these capital gains taxes, probably forcing a lot of them out of business, right, Jonathan?
Well, precisely. And this is an often forgotten point by the Bernie Sanders crowd up here in D.C. as they want to go after this evil 1%. And let's just unpack who that 1% is. And it's exactly right. Many of those family business owners that have been struggling on the ropes, in some cases barely made it from this environment with COVID and the government lockdowns and everything like that, and the trial lawyers chasing them out of business in many cases. And now we would hit them with this additional tax rate and count it that in the press it's talked about as just the fat cat millionaires and billionaires, but let's not forget about the mom and pop restaurant or the convenience store down the street. Somebody that's put their livelihood into this over decades is now at threat because of this kind of quote-unquote tax for the rich.
Well, and that's the demagoguery is just astounding. As I think we said the last time we talked, the 70s are on the phone and they want their economic policy back. Then we start seeing missiles being fired into Jerusalem and gas lines. I'm like, hold it. I was just kidding about the 70s, Jonathan. But Jonathan Williams being on with us, Chief Economist at the American Legislative Exchange Council, the tax policies, but also, you guys are famous for the Rich States, Poor States report. We're starting to see some states pushing back on some of these buy-offs.
Well, absolutely, because they realize the inherent danger. There's no such thing as a free lunch coming from Washington, D.C., and sure enough, Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin and others put that amendment on the federal quote-unquote stimulus bill as it related to federal aid to the states and the bailout of states, and said if you take federal money, you can't directly or indirectly cut taxes with it. And that is exactly the kind of thing that is this bait and switch that's saying we're going to give you more money because you need it at the state level. And then when you take it, guess what? Now we control you. And that is something where state legislators across the country are very concerned about that. It's a horrible precedent to set for any of us who believe in that kind of old school quintessential American principle of federalism in the 10th Amendment and the Bill of Rights. That is a huge existential threat to the states and our autonomy going forward.
Well, isn't it, though, fair? I'm going to play the role of the leftist for a moment. Let me disengage my intellect for a moment and just go with my emotions. My emotions tell me, haven't you already taken all this money for the schools? So why can't you take the money for everything else? How was that? Did I sound like a leftist?
That was pretty good. That was pretty good.
Thank you very much.
Well, and the point is, though, that, Joe, is state and local governments actually, believe it or not, contrary to the wailing and gnashing of teeth saying the states are broke at the end of this last year, state and local governments collected more in calendar year 2020 than they did in calendar 2019. And so the idea that school districts or local governments or states, by and large, are lacking for revenue is a complete misnomer. In fact, I talked to a lot of budget type people in the states and the legislature as part of our work at ALEC, and they actually don't know what they're going to do with all the money that's sitting around in many cases because their revenues recovered if they did the right thing, especially reopen their state economies. And then on top of that, they get the first tranche of federal support last year with the CARES Act. And now with this new money with all the strings attached, there's some real discussions to say, do we even have any good uses for this new money? And if so, is it worth the strings that are attached to it?
Well, and that's the dangerous part is the strings that are attached to it. Now you mentioned the hack on actual infrastructure, a fuel pipeline where our digital security systems and I don't want to blame just the internet or hackers any more than I want to blame a firearm when there's a shooting. Somebody at the pipeline company clicked open, and then that malware was there. I'm not going to let go of this. But that being said, they're using it as a narrative to talk about things like nationalizing the oil and gas distribution grids, nationalizing our cybersecurity force. Is there anything that has ever been nationalized in the United States, law enforcement, anything that has actually come out better the other end?
Well, probably not, because we don't believe in one-size-fits-all central power here in the United States. I mean, that's where part of the unique part of the American story and the American experiment is we have these 50 laboratories of democracy, right? And we want power to be decentralized. And that's part of the big fight that we're engaged in every single day, Joe, at ALEC, is to ensure that states and local governments have their proper voice, to ensure that the federal government doesn't come in and override those voices. But I will say, on a concerning note, it seems like if there is a common thread of what's happened at the federal level here since January, it is then every single package, whether it's talking about H.R. 1 and the kind of federal takeover of elections, right. Whether it's the so-called infrastructure package, which includes things like the PRO Act, that would outlaw state right-to-work laws, whether it's the quote-unquote stimulus package that we talked about would ban states from cutting taxes. It seems like the common thread is exactly, unfortunately, that point, Joe, is that the federal government is trying to take more and more power with every single thing that they've pushed as a priority in this Congress.
Jonathan Williams, American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC.org. Who is really pushing this agenda? I had an eye-opening discussion in which somebody said, the corporations, the big corporations, are really all for this. They're fine with it because they have to deal with these tyrannical, and I say it that way, lowercase t, not like they're running around with tanks, but anytime there's no liberty, there's tyranny, and a government that can tell you what is and isn't your right or isn't your privilege is tyrannical, even in the most soft-core abstract. These corporations have to do business in communist China, so they would like the United States to be more like them, so they don't have to pay for health insurance for their workers, so they can pay them less because they don't have to worry about housing them and that kind of thing. Is that dangerous, and have we allowed these multinationals to get too big and too powerful in D.C.?
Well, I'll say, there are probably some companies that we've all seen in the news that follow that woke kind of corporate culture that's caused them a whole lot of heartburn and getting away from some of the core business issues that have made them great companies over the course of their history in the United States. Then you have to also, I think, Joe, think about what is it now that they have kind of asked for in some cases, which is, if they, let's say the corporates did in some cases maybe support President Biden, support members of Congress on that side of the aisle, guess what they're met with is all of a sudden now, unfortunately, and this has to be a bit of a shocker to some, which is corporate taxes going up pretty dramatically, right? From the Trump tax reform that took corporate rates down to 21% and basically got the U.S. back to average, let's not forget, around the developed world. When you add in the state and local rates on top of it, we were right around the OECD average, a little bit above. And then this proposal, at least the starting ask, of going from 21% U.S. corporate rate to 28%, and then adding state and local on top, puts the United States way above most of our competitor nations, including communist China, as you mentioned, and it puts us in a horrible position. So you have to wonder, is that what was bargained for as some businesses supported that side of the aisle? And then, I talked to many others that are very concerned about the current trajectory of things and had said, hey, we had given wages and bonuses to our employees, after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We all saw that in the news around Christmas time after President Trump signed it into law. And now President Biden, in his speech to America, says, there is going to be, no benefit from that tax reform, right? And we have collective amnesia of what the business community was able to give back to the American economy because of good policy. And now, unfortunately, that may be reversed because of many of these recent proposals.
Well, you mentioned tort. I know a lot of businesses are recalcitrant regarding opening up after COVID because their fear is COVID-19 is the new I slipped onto your sidewalk, as well as not, so they want guidance there, but they also have workforces who are getting paid $32,000 to stay home. That's not sustainable. Even Joe Biden said, you can't turn down jobs. I think he's playing with words because that his speech implied that somebody was calling you for a job. But we can't just keep giving people $32,000 a year, can we?
Well, I'm glad you brought this point up because I actually think that this is a classic textbook case of how politics are completely a 180-degree difference from good economics in many cases. And we know when you tax people who work and you then pay people not to work, we're going to have real problems with the labor market because of the disincentive effect that we've created. And in recent days, as you've seen, we've seen governors, starting with Governor McMaster in South Carolina, Governor Gianforte in Montana, and now probably another dozen in recent days have announced that they're going to back away from the enhanced federal bonus unemployment benefits for this very reason, because they see unemployment rates going down, in a lot of cases in the 3 or under 3% range. And these states have a huge problem of unfilled jobs. We're incentivizing people not to go back into the workforce, and then all of a sudden we're surprised when they don't. And so while I understand it's going to be a little bit of a difficult political argument to be made, and you can just hear the headlines now from the liberal media saying these big companies and big Republican politicians want to take away people's unemployment checks, but the reality is absolutely the reverse, which is we must undo this disincentive effect and get people back into earned success in the workplace. And that is the only way we're going to fix our situation with all of these unfilled jobs in so many states, especially during the crucial tourism season, and the thing that will keep many of these travel industry companies afloat. Otherwise, they just may not make it through the season, Joe.
Absolutely. Jonathan Williams, American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC.org. I can't imagine where you would think such a thing about our elected representatives like Chuck Schumer, who would say that asking for photo ID was taking away your right to vote. They would, what would make you think that they would have such an egregious bent on the American language? I do appreciate your time. Read all about it at ALEC.org and have a blessed weekend, sir.
Great to join you as always, my friend.
Coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the founder of America's Black Robe Regiment, Reverend William Bill Cook, will join us, blackroberegiment.us.